Okay, welcome everybody. And my name is Gundolf Strehl. I'm originally from Germany. I'm a psychologist and recently also received my title as an occupational therapist. I'm trained in the family therapy based on Virginia Satir, where I also got a degree in, or a master's degree in the enriching program, which is certified by the Virginia Satir Global Network. And since 8 years now, I live in Argentina, in South America. And the last couple of years, I really started focusing more on, in my private practice, on working on trauma, on betrayal trauma, on attachment, and how those things affect our life, and especially how we can understand and explain certain reactions on the level, on the neurological level. And today I will talk about trauma, and that's the title of the presentation. Let's talk about trauma. And I believe that we all, in a certain degree, have some trauma, minor or major experience in our life. At least that's what I can see in my private practice with my clients. And I will talk about different types of trauma, and I will also talk about how we can understand and explain what is happening when we are in a trauma reaction in our brain, and also what we can do, what is helpful to get out of a trauma reaction. So before we start, I really want to take a moment to invite you to sit comfortable and put your feet on the floor and take deep breaths, or some deep breaths, and connect with your body for a moment, and make sure that you are in a good and safe place, and be aware that we will enter, because talking about trauma is not something that we usually do, so we are entering actually in an extraordinary space. And I just want to make sure that you are aware of that, and that you that there might come a lot of emotions up, and that is okay. And if you feel like you don't want to participate because of the emotions, that is also okay. The most important thing is that in that way you take care of yourself, what is helpful and necessary for you, because that's one of the great lessons actually in terms of trauma, that we can learn really to be in contact with ourselves and be aware of what we need. Okay, so really connect with yourself and be aware. That might come up a lot of things, because we are talking about things that are not common. Okay. I will give you a brief overview of how I organized the presentation today. So I will give you a view on what is trauma actually, how can we define trauma, and then I will talk about what happens in our brain when we are in trauma. And then I will see, or we'll look into some parts of what could be helpful when we are in trauma and how we can get out of a trauma reaction. And also, what is complex trauma? Okay, this is a different way of seeing trauma on a more general base. Okay, what is trauma? Let's jump into some definitions. Okay, the first definition is coming from the World Health Organization, and it says that it arises as a delayed or protected response to a stressful event or situation. of either brief or long duration, of an exceptionally threatening or catastrophic nature, which is likely to cause pervasive distress in almost anyone. Okay, what it says actually is that our body is exposed to a situation, an unexpected situation that produces a situation where we have to deal with it, and it changes in a way that is really kind of changing the whole situation. Come here. Everything okay? Okay. So in that way, where the World Health Organization definition is really looking to is on the event, actually. Okay, so we are exposed to a traumatic event that could be a car accident, that could be a natural catastrophic situation, that could be a war situation, and we have a response to that. Okay, so trauma is any type of distressing events or experience that can have an impact on a person's ability to cope and function. Okay, because it takes us out of the normal situation and brings us into a completely extraordinary space where we have to learn and see how we can deal with that situation. The definition that I prefer in my work comes from Dr. Gabor Mate, and he says trauma is not the event that happens on the outside. It is the internal disconnection from the world as a reaction to the event. Okay, I will read that again because it is really for me, it is really a very good description on the neurological and emotional level what's happening. Okay, trauma is not the event that happens on the outside. It is the internal disconnection from the world as a reaction to the event. Okay, he changes the focus from the event to really the internal process of it. So that means trauma is in the first place a disconnection from one's emotions, and with that from oneself. In a little bit, I will explain why that makes a lot of sense, why we really disconnect from our emotions in traumatic situations. Okay, so I will talk a moment about what are the typical symptoms of trauma. And that could be typical symptoms in the PTSD or post-traumatic stress syndrome, or in complex PTSD, okay, what I call complex trauma. On the first side, there are episodes of repeated reliving of the trauma in intrusive memories that normally we call that flashbacks, okay, that we remember moments of the traumatic event and our brain goes really back to that place. And it's not only flashbacks, we really emotionally experience the same situation in those moments. So our whole nervous system really goes back to that place. We have dreams or nightmares about the traumatic event. We have occurring against the persisting background of a sense of numbness and emotional blunting. Okay, so we really internally, because the emotions are so much that we got numb or we got really blunt emotionally because we cannot handle the situation. What we can also often see is a detachment from other people, because that also goes back to the emotional connection. We are not able to connect really when we are in a traumatic situation or in a trauma reaction. We also are not really in a good place to respond to our environment because it involves too many informations for us. So we are in a certain way unresponsive to this. And we are trying to avoid any activities or situations that might remind us of the traumatic event. Okay, normally there are states of autonomic hyperarousal, so that's that we are physically highly activated, and in a combination with hypervigilance, which means we are very, very sensitive to all kinds of stimuli. And and we have an enhanced startle reaction. So we can, for example, a loud noise can trigger us tremendously, and we go right back into the traumatic reactivity. And often we also see that people have tremendous problems sleeping, insomnia. Anxiety and depression are really common, connected to the symptoms, and at least a lot of people have suicidal ideas, which doesn't mean that they really act out on it, but they are so overwhelmed with emotions that they can't handle them, and then those ideas might come up. The actual trauma reaction, at least as defined by the World Health Organization, is that it may range between some weeks or 2 months. If you have really had a very traumatic situation, it can also have a duration of years, okay? And in a certain way, there's always a possibility that you can be triggered by some things even years after the traumatic event. The course is fluctuating, but recovery can be expected in the majority of the cases, okay? And especially when we are talking, and that's what I see in my private practice a lot, is when we're talking about complex trauma, I strongly believe that we can, in the majority of the cases, we can really recover from it, because if we understand the behind the scenes what's happening, then we can deal completely different with it. Okay, now we are coming to the, from my point of view, more interesting area, because I will try to explain you what happens in our brain when we are in a trauma reaction, or how we get into a trauma. Okay, what happens there? And therefore I will refer to Stephen Porges. He is a psychologist, and he works on the polyvagal theory, and he found out that our autonomic nervous system, as we have learned, at least I have learned in school, that it's organized by the sympathetic and parasympathetic reactions, and he found out that we actually have 3 parts of the autonomic nervous system, and 2 parts of them are organized or inverted by the by 2 branches of the vagus nerve. Okay, and so he really works on understanding the different branches of the vagus nerve and how they are functioning and what they are doing in our brain. Our autonomic nervous system works actually through what he calls neuroception, which means our nervous system constantly is checking information from the outside and from the inside, okay, within our human body, okay? Therefore, he is checking the systems of the breathing, the heart rate, the muscle tone, the hormones, the activity of the digestive system, the facial expression, and the voice regulation, and our hearing capacity, okay? Our brain constantly is checking where we are in terms of those different systems. And out of those information, the brain really plus the information that the brain gets from observing a person on the outside or a situation, the brain really takes very quick decisions if we are in a safe place or if we are in a dangerous place or if we are even in a life-threatening place. And depending on the decision of the brain, it starts certain activities to protect our body. Okay. On the picture here, you can see the three different nerves that are working in the autonomic nervous system. Okay. And the first one is a light blue one, which is and helps us in terms of the social communication system or safety. Okay. And that is the part that makes us really different from other animals, because with that part, we have the possibility and the capacity actually to build connections and build relationships with others. Okay. And this is our, actually internally, this is our to-go place where our brain tends to go. We really have learned over the time that if we are in a group of people or if we are in a relationship, we are much safer and we have much more possibilities to survive. Okay. If the brain detects that we are in a dangerous situation, then the response is towards a possible danger. Okay. And the red one, which is also part of the vagus nerve, is when the brain detects that we are in a life-threatening situation, and the only activity that the brain is starting then is just makes sure that the body and the resources survive, so that when we are out of the life-threatening situation, that the body can reactivate and can try to go back to social communication system or safety. And our body, with those three parts or three different levels of reaction, we constantly tend between action and relaxation. And in general, the goal of the brain is to make sure that our body is safe, because without the body, we don't have any possibilities to survive. That's why we have very strong reactions when the brain detects danger or life-threatening situations. Okay. What you can see here is a presentation of the three different areas of and their reactions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, the green area describes the social interaction, the yellow area describes the danger reaction, and the red describes the life-threatening reaction. Okay, so the green one is really about the social engagement and playfulness, where we feel safe and secure, and it's organized by the ventral vagus nerve. Then we have the yellow part, where we talk about in the first moment, we talk about the arousal and healthy aggression. Okay, when for example, arousal happens when we are in a physical activity, our heart rate goes up, our breathing goes up, our muscles are activated. That is for the brain the information that we are activated, but we are in a healthy aggression. For example, in a sports activity, when we play a football match or something like that, we have a healthy aggression because we can hold to our limits. We can fight in a positive way without getting really aggressive to get a goal or something like that. So this is part of the actually the social interaction, but for the brain, it already gives the information that we might be closer to a danger situation, or the brain at least detects some of the information that might bring us to a fight or flight reaction. Okay. when the brain detects from the outside, for example, that somebody is very aggressive, then it detects with that automatically danger and activates the flight or fight mechanism. This area is organized by the sympathetic nerve or the sympathetic nervous system reactions, okay? I will go into those in a moment. And then we have the red area, which is on the one hand side, the immobility without fear. Okay, when we are coming from a social interaction and we are going into relaxation, then we are in immobility without fear, which is in a certain way a healthy stage. But it also has the information that there might be something happening there. On the other hand, if we can find a solution through a fight-flight reaction, then the brain activates the dorsal vagus nerve, because that's for the brain the information we are in a life-threatening situation and we go completely to immobilization. Okay. So, yes, this is our normal state, or as Porges would describe it, as the optimal dynamic range of the autonomous nervous system. Okay. In this area or in this range, we feel safe. We can socially connect with other people. We are relaxed. We can go into playfulness. And we can also go into the arousal and healthy aggression part, where we can, for example, if somebody is saying something that we don't like, we can put a limit to that in a healthy way without getting really into any fight or flight reaction. And we can go to on the other hand side, we can go to immobility without fear, where we can relax. That's, for example, happens when we are sleeping or when we are intimate with a partner. Okay, and our body and our nervous system is navigating between relaxation and activity in this area constantly. Okay, so once we pass a certain threshold of information on the brain level, then the brain goes into the highly activated dynamic range of the autonomic nervous system, which is when we feel danger. And then we go very fast into a fight-flight mode. And the fight-flight modes are also organized in a hierarchical way. The fight reaction is that first we feel some frustration, then we feel irritation, then we feel anger, and then it can end up with rage. The fight reaction in the first place is really a reaction where we feel like we can win over the component, okay? We have more strengths or we have more capacities. That's when our system says we can go to a fight reaction. If we realize, or the brain realizes, we don't have the strengths to really win a fight with that person, then we tend to go to a flight reaction, which starts with some worries, concerns, goes over to anxiety, fear, and panic. Okay, if we can solve this dangerous situation, our brain can easily go back to that place, okay? Go back to social interaction and go between healthy aggression and immobility and reconnect with the people. If we cannot solve a dangerous situation, then our brain activates the dorsal vagus, and with that, the dysregulated dynamic range of the autonomic nervous system. And that's when we feel our life is threatened and we go into immobilization. And the idea here is the conservation of energy, okay? And the reactions are numbness, shutdown, helplessness, trapped, hopelessness, dissociation. If you look at those words, you might understand why I say this is really when we are in a trauma reaction, because a lot of the things that are describing this state are also described in the definition of PTSD, or as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, from the World Health Organization. Okay, there is this numbness, there is this shutdown. We are not connecting with other people. We feel overwhelmed. We feel trapped in ourselves. We feel helplessness, or we are dissociating. Okay, so that's why I bring this slide back up. We have flashbacks, for example, dreams or nightmares. We feel this numbness, emotional blunt, detachment from other people, unresponsiveness to the surroundings, and avoidance of activities. Okay, the idea of this stage for the nervous system is really to save energy and protect the body, so that when we have the possibility to get out of this place, that we can reconnect and continue, if you want to say, living. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that brings us to the next questions. What is happening, or what can we do when we are in a trauma reaction? How can we get out of it? Okay, so how do we get out of the dysregulated dynamic range of the trauma? For the nervous system, it is very difficult to get out of a trauma reaction. So that's why we need co-regulation. What does it mean, co-regulation? It means we need somebody that can create safety for us, so that we can reconnect with our body and the environment, and can go with the help of another person back into a state of where we can connect socially. That's, for example, why a therapeutic setting in working with trauma clients is very important, where we create a lot of safety, and the therapist can guide the person back into a safe place where he can reconnect with others. Okay, so in the first place, we really have to understand that for the brain, it is really life-threatening, and getting out of that situation takes, in the first place, time. And it is much easier for the brain if it can connect with somebody that helps walk us back into the place where we really feel safe and can connect. Then the next step is learning tools to handle a life-threatening situation in a healthy and competitive way. Okay, which means when we are in a trauma reaction, we need to learn different tools, because that's where we can learn to cope with the situation differently. Okay, that's, for example, in therapeutic context, is where EMDR is really helpful to give the brain different information and new information to deal with the situation. And the other thing is that the clients have to learn to self-regulate. Okay, that they realize, wow, I'm going back into trauma reaction. What kind of tools do I have? Understanding the reaction and the reactivity of the brain, and what we can do about that, because we can, with some easy things, we can really stop the reaction, or minimize the reaction, or slow the reaction down. Okay, when we feel like, okay, we're going into a fight-flight reaction and this situation is really not going in a good direction, maybe we can step out of it to stop going ourselves to a place where we are in a completely dysregulated range. The things that are in that moment are really helpful is reconnect with the breathing, consciously reconnect with the breathing. And with that, we are reconnecting to our body. We are influencing most often our heart frequency. We are also having an impact on our muscle tone. And all of that are information for the brain to calm down the situation and try to go back to the self-regulated place or the social capacity to connect with others. So those are really some of the very easy tools that we can remind if we are in going into the direction of a traumatic response. If we have time, I can give some other ideas at the end of the presentation, what we can also do. Okay, and here I also want to talk a moment about Virginia Satir, founder of family therapy in the United States. The things that are really helpful when we are talking about the co-regulation part. How do we co-regulate? Be present as a human being. Okay, that was one of her tools in a therapeutic context, but also in the human connection context. Be present as a human being so that the other person gets, or the brain of the person that is in a trauma reaction gets the information, I'm in a safe place because there's a human being in front of me that will not hurt me or that will not harm me. What she was really good at was building a heart connection with the client. Okay, that is really connecting on the heart level and feeling the pain or the irritation of the other person, I would say, out of the therapeutic context. Is that where we really can help another person try to connect on the heart level and understand at least that the person is in really a painful place. And at the end, relationship is really what brings healing into a traumatic situation. And the other thing is help them walk through the chaos to find new possibilities. For me, this is really the information is give the person the space to process the internal things that are connected to trauma, because trauma situation is in general very chaotic and it is very difficult for the person to find new possibilities to cope with that. So in that way, it is really important to just be there as a human being for them and give them the information they need in terms of safety, okay? The one thing that if we talk about trauma, actually the one thing that we have to understand is that trauma means really that the nervous system feels completely unsafe. And that's why they are having all those reactions. Just give me 1 second. You have to cut that out, Victoria, because I'm putting my son to bed. Okay, the other person I want to mention here is Gabo Mate. He's a psychiatrist, a doctor, and he works with addiction and trauma. And the way he works with his clients is what he calls compassionate inquiry. And I will talk a moment about that because there are some things in it that I believe are very helpful to understand how to work and deal with trauma. Okay. And he says really that compassion for everything the person has or does, so that we don't judge person for his reactions or for the thoughts they have, the emotions that come up. We just be compassionate with that. Because when we are in trauma, we are so overwhelmed with emotions that it's very difficult to handle them, to deal with them. And if we have somebody that can be compassionate with us in this moment, that is really what creates a safety. And compassion for him has also to do with guiding people to their truth, to their essence, or to their true self. Okay, because the trauma disconnects us completely from ourselves. And with that, it is the compassion really helps us to reconnect with that, and then we can calm down the system. And inquiring in that way means just being curious about the person and the truth behind what has happened. Okay, so really, on the first place, have compassion for the person and be curious about it. Okay, those are two tools that they can do every human being. When we see somebody's in a trauma reaction, we can be compassionate with that and we can be curious about that. So that brings us actually to the last point of the presentation, which is what is complex trauma. And here I would like to quote Dr. Omar Menwala. Dr. Omar Menwala is a psychologist and sexologist, and he works for 15 or 20 years, more than 20 years, I guess now, in the field of sex addiction and betrayal trauma. And he has a very complex model, but what he says about complex trauma is it's patterns of harm with a consistent theme over time, where there's a lack of ability to escape, shapes the person and the psyche. Okay, so we have certain patterns of harm that are coming again and again and again to the person, and the person is in a place where the person is not able to escape it, and that shapes the person. So we are talking actually about complex trauma shaping during childhood and adolescence, because children and adolescents, for various reasons, cannot escape certain situations. Okay, and this is his model. I'm not going into this model. The thing that is very important for me is this part number 6, the complex trauma shaping, because he says that in a certain way, we all have experienced some kind of complex trauma during childhood or adolescent, and that shapes our way of ourself, of our psyche, and of our behavior and our reactivity. And those themes that create the complex trauma are, in the first place, attachment injuries or injuries on the body, gender, or sex tissue, how he calls it. So the self in it is created on a good portion on the way of how we define and see our own body, how we define and build and construct our gender, and how we define and describe our own sexuality. If we have experienced attachment injuries or injuries on the level of the body, and that could be physical or verbally, or on the construction of the gender, or on the construction of the sexuality, then there's a huge possibility that we have a certain amount of complex trauma shaping. And the important part here is that the trauma base really affects the construction of the self, because it affects really any of those 3 tissues. And it also produces what he called second brain injuries, or the loss of the connection to one's gut feelings. Because as children and adolescents, we are in a dependent situation, we have to make sometimes decisions and say, is what our parents are saying right, or can I trust my own gut's feelings? And most often we have the tendency to say, okay, we trust our parents because we rely on them. So how can we explain this shaping of complex trauma? Therefore, we have to understand certain things in the important needs of children. Okay, and the two most important needs of little children are the longing for attachment, to connect with the parents, and the longing for our authenticity, which means to live and express ourselves or our essence. And the other important thing is that little children or small children can only attach through physical experience because they don't have the verbal capacity to express themselves. They use very often the body, okay? They use the body to express what they're experiencing when they get angry, when they are happy, when they are sad. And that's also their instrument or their tool to connect with their parents. When a little child, for example, is frustrated with something, it normally starts to cry, and then it needs the help of the parents or a hug or being held, and that's a physical experience that children need to feel safe again, because children are really desperate for relationships because they instinctively know without a relationship, without somebody that helps me, I have very little possibility to survive. And the next thing that is really important to understand is that children get very easily overwhelmed by their own emotions. Okay, they don't have tools to understand their emotions and to handle their emotions. And they cannot regulate their own emotions. That's why they're very dependent to adults, and that's why they need adults to help them regulate themselves and their emotions. So going back to that idea of child is frustrated because something is not working, it starts to cry. That is actually the information. I don't know what to do emotionally with the situation. Can you help me? And if parents are available or not available, shapes in a certain way their childhood reality and can shape a childhood trauma. Okay, and I'm not talking about this one moment. I'm talking of the repetition of those situations when parents, for example, because they need to work or they are overwhelmed with themselves with emotions, they cannot help the kid to regulate. Then the kid doesn't know what to do with those emotions. Okay, and the main information that we can take out of that is that for a child or an infant, it is very important that it is held physically and, more important, emotionally by their parents or by their caregivers. Otherwise, they don't learn to deal and regulate and to handle emotions. When they are alone with their hurt or the emotions and don't have anybody that soothes them, they get easily traumatized because it's the repetition again of the same situation that brings us into a traumatized situation. Here, I just very briefly will show you the different stages of the socialization, which are brought up by Erik Erikson, a psychologist, and he was putting the lifeline of the human beings into different stages. And in every stage, he says, we are learning a certain emotional importance. For example, an infant learns basic trust. If the parents are not available, they are learning basic mistrust. When the child starts to walk, the toddler actually starts to learn autonomy. If the parents don't help the child with growing into the autonomy, they learn to be shamed and doubt about themselves. Okay, the preschool children learn to have their own initiatives. If the parents don't support that, they can easily go into guilt. Then the school age children, they learn to do things. Okay, if the parents are not, or the system here already, because the school is already a system that has an impact on the growing ups, if we don't help them with this process of learning to be productive and to do things and trust themselves, they feel easily inferior. And then the adolescent is when they are building the identity, and if they are not really helped in that state, they easily can go into role confusion. Okay, so for me, in the therapeutic process, if I find any of those basic mistrust, shame, doubt, guilt, or any of the others, I can at least have an idea of in which stage the person has been traumatized in their growing up. So this is for me a very helpful tool. Okay, let's talk a moment about the different forms of how people can be shaped in terms of complex trauma. The first thing is patterns of harm to the physical body. Okay, when children receive a lot of physical violence, that has an impact on their trauma shaping. Psychological, emotional, or physical forms of neglect, when they are constantly receiving negative information from the caregivers. When attachment and bonding injuries, so when they don't feel safe in the relationship with their parents, or they cannot build this attachment, that forms part of the trauma. And psychological or emotional patterns of harm, those are more aspects where society already is included, like the school system or other contexts, for example, sport context, where they might be devaluated for not being fit enough, not being good enough, not being fast enough, things like that, or not being smart enough. So that those are levels of psychological and emotional, or what we see today a lot, the bullying at school. Those are psychological and emotional patterns of harm that are often connected to the body or gender construction, or when they're a little bit older, or even to the construction, internal construction of the sexuality. Okay. Going back to Gabor Mate, trauma means in the first place a disconnection from one's emotions, and with that from oneself. So if we can imagine a child growing up and receiving any of the, on a constant base, any of the emotional neglect or disqualification, comments about their body or about their responses, any of that brings them in a place where they are overwhelmed with emotions on the long run, okay? And they disconnect from that. And underneath a traumatized person, I strongly believe that, and that's why I work in therapy towards that, is a healthy self, or the essence, that never really has learned to express themselves. And our childhood and attachment injuries are often very close to the surface, and they show up very easily. Also, most of the time we are not aware of it, okay? And that's when, for example, when we have very strong emotional reactions in a moment, we do not do not respond to the present moment. We respond most likely to the past or the complex trauma we have that has been triggered by the present moment. Okay, we can see that, for example, in intimate relationships, that our partner says something and we really have a very strong emotional reaction in an instant. We can be very assured that it has nothing to do with our partner. The partner just has triggered our past and we are responding to that. So, and going back to all the explanation of the brain reaction, our brain responds to the trigger with the same old trauma response without having a new solution. Okay, that's why we feel very often stuck in it. Okay, so going back to the explanation of the 3 different stages, when we are triggered, our brain really jumps from a social interaction right into the immobility and the trauma reaction. Okay, how can we get out of that? Is, in the first place, trauma needs time to heal because our nervous system needs a lot of time to understand that it has different capacities and different possibilities to deal with the situation. Trauma needs really relationships to heal. Okay, our brain cannot heal from, especially from complex trauma. Our brain cannot heal by itself. Our brain needs healthy and truthful relationship and safe relationships to heal those traumatic, complex traumatic wounds so that we can have different tools towards it. And as I already said, trauma needs honesty and truth to heal. Okay? With that, we can really make disappear the trauma reaction on the long run, and then we can go back to create different ways of relating, different ways of connecting, and different ways of being in relationships. Okay, this is it for today. I thank you for watching this and participating in that. And I also, as the last slide, I have the information of the persons that I have mentioned here. And there's also my internet page if you would like to have more information about me. Okay.